It seems logical that dietary modification would be part of a protocol when addressing gut dysfunction. In the case of SIBO, it's a commonly held belief that the FODMAPs diet is the best choice. But the FODMAPs diet is not a SIBO diet. It's actually an IBS diet with very little support for SIBO, especially on an ongoing basis. As such, a new approach to the use of diet in SIBO is in order. Let's reorganize our thought process about diet related to SIBO. After reading only a few papers on the use of the FODMAPs diet in SIBO patients, you start to wonder why anyone would move forward with this diet. SIBO is a state of dysbiosis, or unbalanced microbes in the small intestine. Ironically, the FODMAPs diet has been stated to worsen the dysbiotic state of SIBO. Now, this is really a head scratcher, and we need to talk about it. But before we do, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and I help first-time and recurrent SIBO sufferers restore their gut function by targeting all three phases of the condition to resolve symptoms in a timely manner. Let's start off by talking about some of the disturbances linked to SIBO. For example, carbohydrate metabolism. You don't digest carbohydrates efficiently. Proteins are not broken down and utilized efficiently. We see fat malabsorption. Vitamin deficiencies are extremely common with SIBO. In fact, nutrient deficiencies are a characteristic of SIBO. We see that digestive enzyme production is going to be reduced. And all of this translates into a worse metabolic state, often hallmarked by inflammation. And one of the common strategies that's often employed here is a reduction in fermentable products. This is one of the therapeutic strategies that's often recommended. So for example, reduction in fiber, sugar alcohols, other fermentable sweeteners like sucralose. And this is generally termed the FODMAPs diet. The FODMAPs diet historically is an IBS nutritional intervention. If you have irritable bowel syndrome, the FODMAPs diet has been shown to be helpful in irritable bowel syndrome. But while irritable bowel syndrome and SIBO may overlap, they're not the same thing. But let's talk for a minute before we delve into that about the specifics around the FODMAPs diet. It's focused on the removal of short-chain carbohydrates with the intent that these are going to be osmotically active, meaning they draw in water. They're going to pull water into the stomach. They're going to increase fermentation and gas production by the bacteria in the small intestine. And the food components that make up the FODMAPs diet, as the acronym implies, are going to be fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And the suggested improvement here is that we should anticipate a modification of the bacterial profile in the gut, in the intestine, in the small intestine, and that we should see a reduction in fermentation and gas. But does this actually happen? Well, the evidence is questionable on this, and let me give one example to say why this may not be the best strategy here, and that is looking at one of the more common sugars in here, lactose. It's a disaccharide. It's two sugars, and one study noted on this that in SIBO, remember that's our focal point here, not IBS, SIBO. In SIBO, some patients may show signs of lactose intolerance, but it is believed to be bacterial lactose intolerance and not a deficiency of the lactase enzyme. What this is saying is that the problem is the dysbiosis. The problem is not the consumption of lactose. It's the issue with the dysbiosis and how that dysbiosis is affecting the presence of the lactose. If the dysbiosis is remediated, lactose doesn't have the same effect. It doesn't create the same problems associated with it. It's also interesting when you talk about the FODMAPs diet that the FODMAPs diet is in regards to how it affects the overall microbial profile. You might initially think that it has a favorable effect on the microbial profile, but this is actually not the case. In fact, we see here a low FODMAP diet proposed for IBS may promote a negative shift in the gut microbiota and deepen the existing state of dysbiosis in SIBO patients. So it's actually making the SIBO presentation worse, not better. So if we just stop right there, why are we looking at consuming a FODMAPs diet? That's questionable. But there's other observations that have been made in regards to dietary patterns that are also relevant to this conversation that can give us direction into what the diet should ultimately look like if it's not going to be a FODMAPs diet. So what other observations do we have? Well, one is related to the overall Western diet, and we know that with increased consumption of a Western diet, we also see an upward trend in obesity, and SIBO is 3 times more common in obesity. Now, what is it that's unique about the Western diet? Well, it's high in refined sugars, just high in sugars in general, high in processed fats, so generally what we would consider unhealthy fats, and these are going to ultimately promote dysbiosis, but we also know that dysbiosis is rampant in obesity. And so as you look at this, one thing that we could draw here is that since SIBO as a form of dysbiosis is 3 times more common in obesity, and obese individuals are generally consuming more of a Western dietary pattern, that a Western dietary pattern could be setting the stage for SIBO. So maybe the real point here is that we need to be moving away from the Western diet. So more of a non-Western diet, and that can have any number of persuasions that we could think about. We could think about a vegetarian diet, I'll go to the other extreme, a carnivore or an animal-based diet. You could have more of the middle ground with a Mediterranean diet. These are all emphasizing whole foods, plant and animal sources. They're going to have polyphenol inclusion in there, but these are going to stimulate the beneficial bacteria, which is ultimately what we need to help resolve that overall presentation of SIBO. So the ideal solution, or this is a more of an ideal solution, is a common sense whole food eating pattern, not getting hyper fixated on these specific forms of carbohydrates. Now, let me be a little bit more specific here too as it relates to FODMAPs, because again, I feel like I need to present to you more evidence of why a FODMAPs diet is not the ideal dietary pattern, even though I've already given you a solution to follow up with here. The FODMAPs diet, when you look at the FODMAPs diet, it's going to be overly restrictive. And restrictive is a subjective term. I'll acknowledge that, but it is generally deemed to be overly restrictive when it's used for a long period of time. It's also suggested to be nutritionally incomplete. So it's going to lack adequate amounts of constituents that are going to stimulate the bacteria in the colon, and it's going to inhibit some of the substrates that they produce. So it's even been termed, the low FODMAP diet has even been termed an anti-prebiotic diet. Now keep in mind, prebiotics are going to stimulate the growth of the beneficial bacteria, but yet the FODMAPs diet has been termed an anti-prebiotic diet. This is not meshing with what we want for when we're dealing with SIBO. FODMAPs are prebiotics, so we want FODMAPs included in the diet in all categories: oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides. These are going to be prebiotic in nature, and they're going to promote the production of what are called short-chain fatty acids, as well as enhancing the production of what we call keystone species, these groups of bacteria that are extremely important to have prevalent quantities in the small intestine and in the large intestine, more so in the large intestine. But specifically, they go by such names as Akkermansia. Well, why is this Akkermansia important? Well, for one, if you haven't heard about Akkermansia, just keep learning about the gut, and you're going to hear more and more about Akkermansia. It's the hot topic right now. But Akkermansia mucinophilia is important because it enhances the overall metabolic function of you as an individual. Faecalibacterium presnitzi. This has anti-inflammatory properties. And you don't honestly need to worry about these different microorganism groups and names. These are getting a bit into the weeds, and I'll acknowledge that. What's more important is that these organisms proliferate when you consume these foods that are often labeled on the FODMAPs diet. You want to consume FODMAPs. You don't want to avoid FODMAPs, Maybe you need to adjust a little bit here and there based on your individual needs for a period of time. But overall, FODMAPs are beneficial to these species that enhance your metabolism and keep your inflammation under control. Keep in mind, when you're dealing with SIBO, the treatment priority in SIBO is to create eubiosis, and that's the opposite of dysbiosis. If dysbiosis is the imbalanced microbial state, eubiosis is a balanced microbial state. This is the whole reason that we should put emphasis on restoring the digestive secretions, promoting motility, and using those antibiotics or antimicrobials on the front end of a treatment protocol, is because we're trying to push back to eubiosis. The more of a eubiotic state you can create in your small intestine, the less likelihood of SIBO you're going to be dealing with. And a FODMAP diet does not support this long term. In fact, another study has stated that the overall potential efficacy of the IBS diet in SIBO, and this is referring to the FODMAPs diet, is largely hypothetical. The evidence to support this, guys, it just doesn't exist. So if you're looking at how to best shape your diet to deal with SIBO, FODMAPs is not the way to go. And even if you land on a FODMAPs diet, keep in mind that even in IBS patients, there's the benefit of FODMAPs diets is really limited to 6 weeks. Beyond 6 weeks, you're not getting any sustained benefit from a FODMAPs diet. Now listen, I know this information is not what you typically hear about SIBO and diet. I get that, but that's a good thing, and it will help you find clarity when you're dealing with SIBO. But if you want to get an even deeper level of understanding about how to deal with SIBO and turn your confusion into clarity, well, click on the video on the screen right now.